I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor, and I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Editing Podcast. So, Louise, tell everyone what we're talking about this week.
Woohoo! I'm interviewing you. Revenge. So you're going to tell me 4 things I'd need to know if I wanted to become a non-fiction editor, which I don't, by the way. Been there, done that, moved along. So we're going to focus on 4 key things: the main types of non-fiction editing and the kinds of things a non-fiction editor needs to look out for, working on complex materials, the move to digital content and the role of the editor, because I think that's quite a specific one that's, well, a little bit more relevant for your field than mine.
Yeah.
And the ethical issues the editor or proofreader needs to be aware of, particularly when working with students. So let's start with the main types of non-fiction editing. And I guess what I want to understand is where there are similarities with fiction editing and where there are differences. So let's start with the similarities.
Yeah, so you're dead right. At its core, there's plenty of crossover. We're dealing with big picture structural work like developmental editing, critiques that assess the manuscript's strengths and weaknesses and its suitability for the target audience, and sensitivity reading, which, although it may not be called that, is still carried out.
So when I edit fiction, I'm mindful of how the dialogue and narrative come across and whether the language used is authentic. And where that language is authentic, is it maybe offensive or harmful? And is that justifiable for the story? So is it mindful or mindless harm? Mm-hmm. So you're doing the same thing with non-fic, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. The same principles of equality, inclusivity, and diversity apply in non-fiction. But in some situations, such as educational materials, we have to go a step further and be aware of the intended market. And that can mean ensuring there are no references to topics that may be offensive there, such as dice games, which are viewed as gambling in some countries, or references to certain foods that are subject to religious restrictions in others.
So that's interesting, because I'm thinking that in fiction, it would be at least necessary for an author to be aware of any such restrictions like the ones you've mentioned, so that the authenticity of their story doesn't end up dropping off a cliff. But in your situation, there's a different kind of pressure, because these are prescribed as teaching materials, which brings with it an extra level of responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't create something that is suitable for that market with teaching materials that perhaps have to be ministry approved, they just won't get that approval. And then in nonfiction, just like with fiction, I'm dealing with sentence level editing, such as line editing, copy editing, and quality control proofreading. And I think the differences are more about what's been done at those different levels rather than the scope of the editing itself.
So let's focus on the macro first. You call it developmental structural editing, just like I would for fiction. That's big picture work for you, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And we might call it content editing because ultimately it's about looking at whether the content works. So developmental non-fiction editors will be looking at things like the overall structure of a book or article, whether the information is delivered in a logical progression, and whether the author builds on their premise and provides evidence in a cohesive argument.
So kind of like a non-fictional narrative arc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in education materials, they'll be assessing whether the content is suitable for the level. If it's a course book or supporting materials, does it match the curriculum? Is the language graded appropriately? Do the exercises make sense and progress the student in a structured and scaffolded way? Whereas in a business book, the focus may be on what's the author's goal? Do they have a clear structure? Is it a how-to book? If so, does it actually tell how to? Because very often that's the intention, but it's not actually what happens in the book.
Yeah. Just becomes a ramble.
Yeah, it starts off with the best of intentions, but doesn't quite deliver. And sometimes it may need case studies and examples to support the author's argument. And that's where something like a scope and sequence document can be really helpful.
scope and sequence. I learned about that term from you. I tell you, you really opened my eyes with that, because it really helped me write my business books and courses and blog posts so much more efficiently by thinking in terms of scope and sequence. It sounds like quite a technical concept, but it's actually rather artful, because it really smooths the writing process big time, and the thinking behind the writing. It really does help you kind of form that creative structure in your head.
It helps you just to focus on what the purpose is of your writing, who you're speaking to, and what you want them to get from what you're writing, and how you get to that. So I suppose the equivalent, obviously, in fiction is, you know, are you a planner or a pantser?
And absolutely, we'd call it an outline.
Right.
But just like with a scope and sequence, an outline can be really, really detailed, or it could be quite brief. It really depends on the author's choice. But
yeah, and it's a great tool for people who struggle with a blank page, which I definitely do.
I know.
I get the fear. You know that, Jess. I get the fear with a blank page. But once you've mapped it out and refined a scope and sequence, it makes the road ahead feel so much more manageable. And I definitely recommend it for any non-fiction writer.
Yeah, me too. Now, you don't offer developmental editing, and yet I hear you talk about structure a lot. Does that mean the lines between developmental work and line and copy editing are blurry?
Yeah, I think they can be, but depending on your client. So if I'm working with a publisher or an NGO, by the time a manuscript or a report comes to me for copy editing, then the content issues have generally been resolved earlier in the process, either by the managing editor or the content editor, or whoever. So I'm focusing on a more technical copy edit of applying house style, correcting spelling, punctuation, and grammar, and preparing the file for typesetting by using word styles or tagging the document with codes. And particularly with the educational materials that I work on, I wouldn't be intervening to change sentence structure, etc., unless there was an issue with clarity. And even then, I'd be consulting with the content editors for the very reason that the language will already have been carefully considered for level.
So hang on a minute, because I think it would be really handy actually to dig into this issue of level, because you mentioned that before, and I should have picked up on it then. So are we talking about English language teaching materials here, or does it go beyond that?
ELT definitely, but actually a lot of non-fiction materials, even beyond education, need to be considered in terms of level. So in ELT, yes, we're talking about very targeted levels of language ability, which are, you know, set in different bands. There's sort of 6 recognized levels. But in any other teaching, you know, whether it's, you know, for GCSEs or A levels, you've got different levels towards the ultimate qualification that you have to move through, and what you're teaching in that book has to match that. So you need to know whether the reader is experienced and knowledgeable about the material, or are they a beginner, or are they somewhere in between? And the editor has to edit with that in mind. So it is more nuanced than just technical, because you have to respect the reader's ability, or what stage they're at in the knowledge journey, if you like, and make sure that the language and the content is appropriate to them. So, for example, an adult beginner in English and a primary school beginner in English might be learning the same language, and they're at the same level of perhaps beginner, like A1, but you wouldn't give them the same types of exercises to do. You know, so it has to be tailored to that as well.
But you would even think that maybe, I mean, is this right, that even with, say, a business book, you know, you could say, have someone like a business author thinks, right, I'm going to create a how-to guide on recycling old furniture and upcycling it and selling it. And if they know a lot about the topic, but they're kind of hoping they're going to be able to convert people who are new to it, you know, that I think sometimes authors come unstuck with what their readers know. So even at that stage, you're probably, when you're working with indie authors, you're having to think about levels, sort of maybe more.
Yeah, definitely, because it's whether it's like you say, an indie author writing about upselling or whatever, or upselling, or say
upcycling your old furniture.
Yes, I knew that's what you meant. I just got the word wrong there. Whether you're talking about upcycling, or whether it's an academic writing for a more general public audience, you really have to consider who the audience is. And that's where the editor can really be the reader's advocate. And it's why it's quite often useful for the editor not to be overly familiar with the subject.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes. Yeah.
Because if they're familiar with the subject too, they've not necessarily got that distance, and they're not necessarily seeing it through the eyes of the intended reader. Whereas if somebody's writing about upcycling and I don't know the first thing about it, I'm going to spot where the writer needs to explain something better.
Yeah.
Or where they're using language, they're making assumptions about terminology and things that the lay reader won't understand.
Perfect sense.
Yeah.
So what about thinking more about your work with indie business authors? Is there sort of a case where you might end up with a situation where some of them might be coming to you for a particular level of editing, but they've had no other work done on it before?
Yeah, I think that's quite common with indie business authors, is that it's not unusual for them, in my experience anyway, to ask for a copy edit without having had any previous editorial input. And in that case, I am more likely to blur the lines if it needs it, perhaps identifying where there are gaps in the flow of information, or where sections need to be expanded with more detail. And I might suggest adding examples or case studies, or maybe taking some out if there are too many that illustrate the same points.
Yeah.
They can get carried away with, because they have lots of case studies, but they're all essentially saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So you have to think quite carefully about
less is more.
Less is more, and it's just padding and fluff, and you don't really need that. Yeah. And I do that as part of a copy edit, really, after discussion with the author, obviously, about what it is they're looking for. So what I would term a copy edit usually encompasses a bit of that, if necessary, plus stylistic line editing, as well as a technical copy edit, because I find it very difficult to separate the two out, especially if there's been no previous editorial input, and they're not looking for lots of separate rounds of editing, because obviously there's a budgetary implication there as well, isn't there?
Absolutely.
But if I felt that, structurally it was a long way from being ready, then I definitely suggest that they paused on my editing to have a proper developmental edit, or even a manuscript critique from a developmental editor, to give them a good review of the whole structure of the book.
That's really similar to fiction. I'd take the same approach. And what about proofreading? Is that different from how we work with fiction?
Essentially not. With publishers, NGOs and comms agencies, the content's established, and I'm usually working on PDF page proofs to mark up any lingering spelling, punctuation and grammar, or house style errors that might have slipped through. And of course, any layout issues that you're only going to pick up at the PDF stage. So things like bad line breaks, orphans and widows, spacing issues, or missing formatting, like missing bolds and italics and things like that.
Well, you have a course about that. Would that be suitable for this market? I would think it would.
I think it would, yeah. So it's called How to Mark Up PDF Page Proofs. And it would be ideal for this situation, because it's teaching you how to do that efficiently and effectively, and familiarize yourself with the Adobe Reader DC interface, which is the one that's most commonly used.
And it's free.
And it is free. Not my course.
No.
The Adobe DC Reader DC is free. And that's all you need to mark up page proofs. I think there's this misconception that you need to have the pro version, but not for proper proofreading. You just need the free Reader DC. And my course can tell you all about that. So we'll stick a link in the show notes, eh?
Yeah.
So, and the other thing to mention about that as well, about proofreading, is that with my indie author clients, I might be much more likely to do a proof edit in Microsoft Word, which we've discussed previously on the podcast.
We have, but let's just explain it quickly here. So this is like a hybrid service that's based on the idea of a traditional quality control proofread, but we're actually amending the raw text rather than marking up designed page proofs. So you come across this a lot, like I do, but I've heard you banging on about other stuff that's that's not
Hanging on.
well, just because it's a bit of it sounds like a minefield to me. Talking about answer keys and whatnot. So can we talk a little bit more about more complex proofreading that non-fiction editors and proofreaders might come across, or more complex editing?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, because what we call proofreading can expand a lot with non-fiction, again, depending on your client and the type of material that you're working on.
Give us an example.
Okay, so most of my work from publisher clients is English language teaching materials. So that's student books, workbooks, teachers' guides, and supplementary materials such as practice tests and self-study books. And the proofreading brief for this type of work, as well as checking for all the usual stuff that I've just mentioned, it will typically include a much broader range of things to check, because there are so many different elements on a page. Now, these could be things like lists, word pools, grammar boxes, tip boxes, things like I can statements, which is the learner outcome for that lesson. Does that match the objective for that lesson? Things like audio or video icons and track numbers, cross-references to additional activities at the back of the book, or references to audio scripts, and teachers' guides. Teachers' guides will cross-reference to the relevant pages in the student's book or the workbook, so they need to be checked as well.
So look, this is a completely different ballgame to proofreading, essentially straight text. And it's such a good reminder why proofreaders, professional proofreaders, really do need specialist training if they're going to take on this type of work. There is no way that knowledge of conventional spelling, grammar, and punctuation is going to be enough. Not even close.
You're spot on, because it's really detailed work, and things like artwork needs to be checked very carefully against the artwork brief and the content, especially when it's in the exercises. So you're looking at it and you're asking questions like, does it match the brief that was given to the illustrator? Does it clearly illustrate what's needed for the student to answer correctly? In my most recent job, I was the first person to see the artwork in place, which isn't unusual for the proofreader. And I had so many comments on the artwork along the lines of, the brief asked for a block of flats by the beach. This looks like a block of flats sitting on the beach. Could we add in a path or a garden to separate the two? Things like that. And then, the brief asks for the girl to be in pain with stomach ache. She just looks a bit sad here. Can she be redrawn bending over with her face screwed up? Because that in context, that picture has to look substantively different from the others so that the student can choose the correct one. So you can't confuse them.
The thing is, those images aren't there to make the page prettier.
No,
they're not. It's not a design or a brand function.
Absolutely
with these kinds of materials, the written message is only half the story. An artwork that doesn't match is going to confuse the reader and distract them from the learning. This is interesting because you're not just proofreading, which people often think means checking text. It's so much more than that. It makes me think, actually, the term proofreading really doesn't do the word justice. It really is content quality controlled, isn't it?
Yeah, it's right, really. Yeah. And of course, the big thing with these sorts of materials is that I have to cross-check the answer key too. And that is so important, especially when it's a self-study book. Because the students are relying on that answer key being correct. So if cuts and changes to the content are made, quite late in the day, maybe a question has to be cut from each exercise to make the content fit in the page, then there may not have been time to update the answer key.
The consequences can be horrendous.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same goes for recording scripts for any listening and speaking activities. Any changes need to be made to the script that's going to be recorded, but also to the audio scripts in the book and to the answer key as well. And that's why I work with 3 screens.
So let's move on to that, because there's been a lot of expansion into digital content over the past few years, and I'd imagine that non-fiction editors have an important role there. I mean, from what you're saying, I mean, just from your work.
Yeah. I mean, these skills, these editorial skills are still needed, but they may be used in a different way. So working on digital learning materials means learning to use new platforms and software, as you might be asked to work maybe in the back end of a learning management system or on templates or authoring tools that are going to be imported into a digital platform.
At which point knowledge of Microsoft Word and all the lovely macros and other add-ins go out the window. I mean, you've got to completely switch your mindset into a different space.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I imagine there's going to be different workflows in play too.
Yeah, definitely. Because we're outside of the traditional publishing workflow and environment now, although it's still major publishing houses that are doing these things, as well as lots of other new players in the markets too. So you might find that you need to familiarize yourself with new ways of team working. So for example, I recently started a new job that's involved getting to grips with Clockify, whereas I usually use Toggle for time tracking. We're using Airtable, which is a bit like Trello on steroids. I've never seen anything like it. It's so impressive, and I am in awe of how the project manager uses it to manage the workflow of a huge team with literally thousands of tasks.
Oh my goodness.
Proofreading in templates that writers and editors have populated, and then I'm transferring that information to a spreadsheet. I'm using an HTML converter to generate code that the platform will read. And we're working in Google Docs and communicating via Slack, both of which I'm comfortable with, but it's a whole new way of working to develop and to create an end product. So we're working in Google Docs and communicating via Slack, both of which I'm comfortable with. And it's an agile workflow. So we're doing things like we're working in sprints and we're having scrums. And much of it's all new to me. And it's new language. It's new language and finding out what these things mean. I'm doing a lot of listening and I'm just going with the flow.
Yeah, I feel a bit dizzy, if I'm honest, and I'm not even doing it. So I think what that makes me ask is, what would you say to listeners who think that just sounds like so far out of their comfort zone? They think they can't do it.
I get that. But while it's true that apart from proofreading the content, none of what I've described is actually a core proofreading skill, the attention to detail and the methodical approach that you need for this sort of work definitely are core skills that editors have, and proofreaders in particular. And what's needed when you're joining a team like this, I think, and what is valued is your ability to read a brief and communicate well within a team, as well as your proofreading skills.
Read the brief. I think that was the very, very first thing I learned when I did my core proofreading training back in 2006. And it's interesting because of course, especially if you're like when I used to work with publishers, of course I would follow a brief, but those briefs were often very similar, and it's easy once you've been in a single workflow for a long time to sort of just like take it for granted.
Absolutely.
And you must never forget that. You must always read the brief every time, because it might just be tweaked a little bit, but it might actually be tweaked quite a lot, and that will determine what's expected of you. And if you're in the team like the one you've just described, where you've got this really complex workflow that you don't do what you've been asked, that has knock-on effects for so many people.
Yeah, and it is a lesson worth learning. That is such a fundamental, but like you say, we can get complacent, especially if we're doing a lot of work for the same publisher or the same client on similar types of stuff. It's easy to slip into a routine. So this definitely is keeping me on my toes, which is a good thing. It's a good thing.
It is.
So I definitely say that people should make the most of these changing opportunities in publishing. I think we have to embrace them and these new ways and not be fearful of the unfamiliar. And in this job, I've been lucky to have a very thorough onboarding. Don't you just love the jargon? And that has made me feel it's okay to take my time to read through all the very many playbooks and checklists and spreadsheets and things and ask questions. And as the project manager actually said to me, she said, we're laying the tracks in front of us as we go.
So she's learning too.
The whole team are, and it's quite it's quite liberating, because sometimes when you're brought on as a proofreader at the end of a project, you feel that everybody's got it down pat and they know what they're doing, you know?
Yeah, and if you're new, that can lead to imposter syndrome and all sorts of things. Whereas actually, when you're all learning together.
Yeah, definitely. So things are constantly changing based on feedback from the client, and you do really get the feeling that everyone's working together as a team. And when you work on your own in your office most of the time, like we do, it is nice to feel that you're part of something bigger, and for it to be so visible in your daily work routine with your scrums when you actually get to see people face to face.
That's a good point, though. A lot of editors, I do hear editors saying that, sometimes they feel cut off from the team environment especially when they've been used to, say, working in an office, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Definitely.
Denise, we've talked about business books and education and digital content. What other non-fiction editing is out there?
Well, to put it simply, anything that's not fiction. I mean, as with fiction, it's a hugely broad catch-all term with many specialisms and subspecialisms. For example, academic and scholarly editing is a huge field and encompasses everything from undergraduate dissertations to PhD theses and postdoctoral research papers and grant applications. And specialist knowledge and a higher degree can be an advantage here, but it isn't always necessary. But there are also important ethical considerations when working in this field. So every university has a different take on the level of intervention allowed, and in fact, whether it's allowed at all. And it can even vary by department within the same institution.
That's really important that editors do their due diligence when it comes to embarking on this kind of work, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people might think that working on theses and dissertations is an easy way of getting started in an editorial career as a freelancer. But I would urge caution. Yes, the work is plentiful and it can be easy to pick up clients who need your help, even if it's not always the best paid, but it can be. But aside from the ethical considerations I've mentioned, there's a lot of skill to working in this field, and you need to understand the conventions, particularly around the different referencing styles and how to handle things like suspected plagiarism.
And I think it's worth mentioning that when editors and proofreaders work on materials beyond the scope allowed by an institution, if that's found out, it isn't just the student who could end up in the doghouse. The editor could be accused of collusion too, which is serious. So if you're thinking about taking this work on, do your due diligence. So is there anything else that non-fic editors might work on?
Ooh.
Go on, surprise me.
Oh, where could I start? Where should I start? Marketing communications, web content, specialisms such as cookery books or board games or travel books, poetry or memoir. We haven't even touched on those. And I guess I'd say where there's content, written or visual, there's room for quality control and therefore an editor.
That's a really nice way to wrap up, because it's a good reminder that there's nothing to stop any editor marketing an editorial specialism that they have experience of or take pleasure in. So I'm off to proofread the text in Genshin Impact. I think.
And that is
the new game that my teenager persuaded me to download onto my iPad and that I might be slightly obsessed with. Anyway, so that's it for this week. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whichever platform you prefer.
Yes, thank you so much for listening to the Editing Podcast, and we'll pop that link to my course in the show notes. For now, she's been Louise.
And she's been Denise. Join us again soon.
Bye.